So you've got an employee, they've broken the rules, but you know they're neurodivergent, or maybe worse, you're into an investigation and suddenly they've declared they've got ADHD, autism, dyslexia, whichever it is that might be causing their conduct. And they've said their conduct is because of this condition, and all of a sudden you panic. You think, can I discipline this person? Is it discrimination if we discipline them? But if we don't, are we letting them get away with it? What about the rest of the team? In this video, I'm going to explain exactly what to do when you can discipline somebody and when we should be making reasonable adjustments, which would mean that we don't have these situations occurring in the first place. This is two really common problems that I come across. The first one being a manager tells me that they've got an employee who's been doing this thing, whether it is a conduct or capability thing, and they've been doing it repeatedly, but the manager feels like they can't do anything about it because they know that the individual is neurodivergent. Perhaps the individual keeps putting that in. Well, if you remember, as I told you, I'm dyslexic. Whatever it is that they're saying, then this stops the manager. It makes them feel like, well, there's this discrimination law. The Equality Act says we can't discriminate. We need to make reasonable adjustments. So therefore, there's nothing I can do about it. Or you're partway through an investigation, you're dealing with either a performance or a conduct issue, and suddenly the individual throws in, actually, the thing I didn't tell you is I'm ADHD. And all of a sudden you put a stop to everything and think, well, we can't do anything now because they've got a disability. But the reality is you can do something, and we absolutely shouldn't be doing nothing. So if you're pausing to think, well, in the team, if we don't do something about it, others in the team are going to be fed up with us. It's going to put more pressure on others in the team. All of these knock-on effects, you're absolutely right. And it's why we need to do something about it. So what do we do? The first step is to identify, is this to do with their neurodivergent condition, or is it behaviour that is completely outside of that? Or actually, is there a combination of both and still something we need to do? These are the questions that we're trying to identify, and I understand that these are going to be the really complex questions that often we don't know what's causing it or what we should do about it. For example, let's say somebody's regularly late for work. That could well be because of a neurodivergent condition, dyslexia, ADHD, for example. Time blindness is really common, just the passage of time disappearing, also the ability to organise oneself. All of these things can challenge us in terms of turning up on time for things. There might be other things like social cues, for example. So somebody appears to be rude because they're not making eye contact in meetings, and that might be to do with their autism. So we need to first look at, well, what is the impact of that behaviour as well? So if it's, well, they appear rude because they're not making eye contact, that's a judgment issue. There's no actual impact on other people, and we can raise awareness rather than dealing with that through any kind of disciplinary procedure, because that wouldn't be relevant. With lateness, for example, it might be reasonable adjustments that are needed. It might be, are there adjustments around time, around the way that we work, or supports that we can put in place to enable the individual to turn up on time? And those are the sorts of things that we'd be looking into. If we're struggling to understand what is linked to a neurodivergent condition or what supports we could be putting in place, that is exactly where a workplace needs assessment would come in. And that would be a detailed assessment looking at somebody's strengths, somebody's challenges, and how we can best support them in a work environment. Ideally, we won't have somebody that's come to us in an investigation and suddenly said, actually, this is what's going on for me, because people will feel confident to talk about these things up front, which means we can put supports in place and we can stop all of these things going wrong before we even start. But I get it, that very often doesn't happen, and things can be a lot more challenging than that. So that's our first step, is to identify whether it's part of their neurodivergent condition or not, and if it is, what reasonable things can we put in place to support somebody. And this is where the word reasonable also comes in. So we need to look then at whether this is conduct or capability. So capability would be can't do. So if it is, I can't turn up to work every day because of my neurodivergent condition, that is a capability issue, not a conduct. It's not something that is chosen. We may, however, see conduct issues. So one that I've come across recently is derogatory language being used and others accusing somebody of harassment. and the defence being used that is their autism. We saw Greg Wallace make this statement publicly, didn't we, that he's blaming his behaviour on his autism. And this is where we need to separate those things out, and that's where it can get really challenging for people in HR to really make those decisions. Fortunately, though, the tribunals are really helping us. We've got some tribunal cases which do reassure us that we can make those decisions and we can make them well. The key is to get the process right. And once things have started going wrong, yes, we're in this kind of muddied, watered situation of, or do we need to make reasonable adjustments? Should we be investigating for a disciplinary? These are all the things that we need to be looking into. And it's why as well we really want to encourage openness about neurodiversity right from the start, right across the organisation, so that we can put the right supports in place. So first questions obviously we're looking at was to identify whether this is something to do with their neurodivergent condition, therefore conduct or capability, and whether we can put reasonable adjustments in place to support somebody. That's where we also look at the word reasonable. So when we're looking at what can we put in place, so let's talk about lateness, for example. Is it reasonable to accept that somebody will be late on a regular basis? Now, there is a tribunal decision around dyslexia and lateness that did tell us that an employer should have accepted lateness where it was acceptable. So this was a security guard. He worked on his own, and in that particular situation, lateness wasn't acceptable because it meant that the place he was guarding was unsecure. However, he could have been moved to another location where there was a team working where the lateness wouldn't have had such an impact. That's where that word reasonable becomes really important. And I know there's a lot of people that don't like the word reasonable adjustments, and I have a lot of challenges and problems around it as well. But in these situations, it is exactly what it means, and it is looking at what's reasonable, what can we do. So that's where we're looking at, well, what can we put in place that would support somebody? If somebody's late to meetings rather than late to work, are there supports we can put in place like reminders and things like that? We're talking really simple adjustments. We're not talking massive things here. And that's one of the key things about neurodivergent conditions. Like we can make small changes that make huge differences and enable people to really thrive within the workplace. But if we have done all of those things, we've made sure we've got the right supports in place, and then either it's not reasonable for us to make the adjustments. So let's say because of the nature of someone's role, it just is not reasonable to allow them to be late. It would create a high risk environment. Let's say someone's a teacher responsible for a class of children and there are not other adults that could be around to provide that sort of support, those numbers, that's going to put those children at risk, and therefore lateness may not be acceptable in that situation. It may not be reasonable to allow lateness as an adjustment. And then there's other situations where it's putting the organisation at risk. So let's say where there's harassment claims, and we know that harassment claims could lead to tribunal claims from the victim, and that employers have a duty to prevent harassment. So if we've got behaviours like that are being blamed on a neurodivergent condition, again, we've got tribunal cases which show us that the tribunals will accept that we can dismiss in those situations. It's absolutely reasonable for us to do so. And it is really important that we do so. It's really important that we don't hold people with neurodivergent conditions on some pedestal that assumes that they can't have done anything wrong, will never have done anything wrong, and never have any consequences for their behaviour. We're human just like everybody else, and if we don't want to create a them and us, which we don't, we want to encourage diverse teams that are cohesive, supportive, work together well, then we need to be holding everybody to the same standards. It's just about making sure that we've levelled that playing field with reasonable adjustments, that we've put things in place where they are reasonable. So I will get comments on my content around this that says, well, when we do this for this person, then that creates extra work for the rest of the team. Well, if that's happening, something is going wrong. That's not reasonable to be creating a whole load of extra work for the rest of the team. If it is misunderstandings, miscommunications, then those are things that we can iron out and deal with things like training, awareness, workplace needs assessments, as I say, to get really into the detail of what supports might support somebody. But don't be afraid to discipline and indeed dismiss somebody where they've breached your conduct rules and put others, themselves, the organisation at risk, and there's not reasonable adjustments that we should have made in the first place to support them. So where you have followed all of the right steps, put all of the right supports in place, and somebody is still breaching the rules or indeed not performing just at the level that the organisation really needs them to be, Don't be afraid. You can still follow your processes. You must still follow your processes. And it would still be fair to dismiss somebody in those circumstances.